All right, guys, so let's get started talking about post-impressionism. Let me open the presentation. So, post-impressionism is a bit different than impressionism in a couple of ways. The first way is that, unlike all of the impressionist artists, the post-impressionists weren't a group of artists that were working together and talking with each other. So with the Impressionists, they were actually sharing ideas. There were groups of people. So it was really focused in France because of that, because we had this group that was meeting and seeing each other in person. Post-Impressionists are really characterized by some basic similarities, but just by the fact that they're painting after Impressionism. So Impressionism really opened up European art to different styles, to different approaches, different thoughts and techniques. And so we see a lot of really different ways that artists are going about painting. The Post-Impressionists were operating in the 1880s, so about a decade after Impressionism started. So you're going to see that we start to get faster and faster turnover, which I've mentioned before. But now we are really going to start to see a really short period of time between different artistic movements, and eventually they'll just start to overlap. So we have a lot going on at the same time. So the post-impressionists are interested in the expressive capabilities of paint. So what paint itself can do, how it's different than other mediums, so how it's different than sculpture. And it's starting to include pieces that are not paint. So with the Impressionists, we really only looked at paintings. And now with post-impressionism, we're branching back out and we're looking at pieces that are no longer paint. So this piece is a poster by Henri Toulouse-Lautrec for the Moulin Rouge, so for a specific show at the Moulin Rouge, which was this Parisian dance hall. And so this was a printmaking technique that he was using to make the poster. So if you remember, he has a plate that he is either carving into or putting marks on the top of and then putting paper down on that plate so he can make multiple copies. So that was used pretty frequently for posters. And his subject matter of this kind of nightlife, art, cafes, the bohemian lifestyle in Paris was a subject of a lot of post-impressionist pieces. So we hadn't seen a lot of nightlife pieces. I know we looked at that Whistler painting of the fireworks at night, but for the most part, most of the pieces were done during the day because that's when light was available. So that's what a lot of artists focus on. So now we start to see pieces that are more focused on nightlife. So nightlife starting to relate more to the lower middle classes and the lower classes. So something that's kind of seedy and not what you would necessarily display. So sort of similar to the ballet, but a little more, I hate to say lowbrow, but that's the way it would have been thought of at the time. And this poster is done with what's called color lithography. So it is a printmaking technique where he was just kind of drawing on a plate and instead of carving into the surface of a plate. So along with that, we have a continued interest in light, but also in optics, so how the eye works. This is still the Enlightenment, and we're still thinking about science. There's a lot of research that's happening. We're really starting to nail down the theories of science that we accept today. There's much more structure to science and how we're approaching. So the scientific method is really starting to be more widespread. And along with that comes an interest in optics and how the eye works. And there's a lot of research being done into how the eye works. We're starting to learn more and more about the eye in the 1880s. And one of the artists who was really interested in that and read about optics was Georges Seurat. You may have seen or heard of this piece, A Sunday Afternoon on the Grande Jatte, and it is famous for something called pointillism. And this is coming out of that idea of how the eye works. And this is not a blurry photograph. This is actually pretty high quality, but it's starting to show what almost looks like pixelation. And if you look closer, you can see it's not actually pixelation. It's these tiny little dabs of color. So this is a pretty large piece. It's something like 6 to 7 feet tall. So you could stand in front of it and, you can get pretty close to it. So you could get close enough to see all of those little dabs of color. But those little dabs of color or dots of color are what's called pointillism. And it comes out of Seurat's idea that you could put these dabs of pure color together and the eye would actually mix them if they were small enough and if you were far enough away. So looking here, you can see all these dabs that he's done, and he doesn't have a huge variety of colors. What's happening is that he's allowing your eye to blend those colors together to get this. So that is one piece that is coming out of this idea of idea of optics. So along with color mixing, there's also an interest in movement. So Starry Night, we've probably all heard of and at least seen pictures of Van Gogh's Starry Night. It's his most famous piece. It's one of the most famous pieces. It's actually fairly small, maybe 2 by 3 feet, and I think I'm over exaggerating the size of it. I have seen it. You cannot get close to it because there's always a crowd. But Van Gogh was interested in how you could show movement in painting because a painting is inherently still. But our eyes, especially at night, tend to see a lot of movement. And I've worked pretty extensively at night doing night photography, and it is really interesting how optics change when you're outside at night, especially when there's a lot of different light sources like we have now. So Van Gogh is recording some of this movement that we see in the sky, movement that we see in plants. He did a lot of paintings of night scenes, again going with that post-impressionism idea of painting at night, painting scenes that take place at night. And you see also a lot of very ordinary subjects. So along with Starry Night, he has a lot of paintings of people working in the fields, of people who are clearly peasants and who are on the lower end of the income spectrum. So you see a lot more of the lower classes represented in Van Gogh's paintings. So again, painting at night. Here is the Café Terrace on the Place des Forum, Arles at night. And there's not as much movement here, but those really kind of chunky, solid brush strokes are still present in this. And it's very clearly a night scene, which again, we really wouldn't have seen before Post-Impressionism. And this is what I was talking about when I said that he was more interested in the working class. So this pair of shoes has clearly been worn. They look like they could have been taken off and perhaps set, in the middle of the floor or by a doorway. They are untied, which makes it feel like they've been taken off hastily. This one is folded down, so they look like they are in use. They don't look like they're sitting in a closet. And of course, they're in this open space. And they look very worn. The leather looks very soft. It's collapsing in on itself. So we can see that this is someone who wears these shoes every day and probably does not have another pair of working shoes that they have to change into or to replace with. So an artist you may not be as familiar with is Paul Gauguin. And Gauguin was part of this kind of naturalist, back to nature movement. So along with Enlightenment thinking and going along with the works of Thoreau, so on Walden Pond, Thoreau, of course, was all about living back in nature, living on his own as much as he could, going back to a simpler way of life. And so this is growing out of the rapid and increasing urbanization and industrialization of especially Europe and the Americas, people start to make rural life into something almost romantic, idyllic. Life was so great back then. People were, simpler and better, and everything was easier. So there's this real kind of idealization of rural life and of the natural world, which of course those of us who've grown up in the country know there's just as many drawbacks, and it has its own set of challenges. But going along with this, Gauguin ended up moving to the West Indies and living amongst the native peoples there. He'd been there traveling and then ended up going back and staying. So he has a lot of scenes of daily village life, of the people that he knows. He's using very flat color, so you can see that, looking at especially the background, there's not a lot of highlight and shadow going on in the background. Looking here where it looks like grass, but it's hard to tell because there's really no detail. So that use of flat color is something that Gauguin is known for. And he's being influenced by two things: block prints, so kind of like those Japanese prints, or like that Toulouse-Lautrec poster, which was very flat, and also stained glass, which of course doesn't have highlights and shadows. And you have those very brilliant colors like you would have in stained glass. One of the other famous Impressionists is Paul Cezanne. Cezanne painted a lot of views straight out from his studio or his porch. So Mont Sainte-Victoire is a view that he had from his house. So there are many, many versions of this. And Cezanne would paint with these geometric patches of color. And you can see it definitely like right here and in the mountain. There are these very geometric squiggles of color. And he felt like painting solid or pure color into a geometric shape and building those shapes up was the pinnacle of painting. This was the way everybody should be painting. Cezanne clearly did not have a small ego, and he really pushed the style. So you see this similar blocky approach with the short brush strokes as opposed to some of the longer brush strokes like you saw here. So you have much longer brush strokes and marks. Those short brush strokes are very characteristic of Cezanne's work. And then we have Henri Matisse. So Matisse was a painter who belonged to a group of other painters called the Fauvists. Fauvist. I realized I probably should have put that in the PowerPoint so that you guys could see the name. But Fauvist was a French derogatory term for these painters, which meant wild beasts. So the French Academy was so disgusted by this work that they gave them this horrible nickname, which the Fauvists ended up embracing. So what was so horrible about this work? They decided to just use arbitrary color, meaning I will put whatever color I want wherever I want it. That was it. So that was enough to get these guys labeled as wild beasts. They're horrible, hideous paintings. But the Fauvists were really interested in color and color relationships. So how cool colors look like they're going back in space, and warm colors look like they're coming forward in space. And just, playing with these color relationships as opposed to making color realistic. No idea why that just clicked back. So a lot of the Fauvist works are very colorful, and they also have a very loose, sketchy quality. So you see that the Post-Impressionists have really broken down the cleanness of the picture even more. So we have these very, very, very loose pieces. And here is another Matisse. that is not only plain with color, because we have this red covered table and then this red wall, and they both have the same pattern. And so the two start to blend into one another. So he's playing with how color changes our perception of space by flattening the space. But he's also flattening everything in the picture. So these trees are kind of cartoon trees. These look like trees that have been drawn by someone very unskilled. But Matisse is doing this on purpose, this really kind of flat and almost abstracted approach. Okay, so along with our painting, we have another movement that happens around the same time as Post-Impressionism, but more starting in the 1890s, called Art Nouveau. You might have heard of Art Nouveau before. It is the movement that came out with the stained glass Tiffany lamp. So this is when the Tiffany company started. And so, of course, they're emulating our more traditional stained glass, like what you would see in Gothic cathedrals. And these Tiffany lamps, they still make them. You've probably seen them before. I have one sitting on my desk in front of me right now, but they were very, very popular during Art Nouveau. We have these styles of posters, and especially this style that has a heavy, almost cartoon-like black outline around everything. We've got the super bohemian style going on here. This young woman with flowers in her hair, with her flowing locks and flowing dress. So very much representing the bohemian lifestyle still. And Art Nouveau, besides being a craft style that we see in furniture, in lamps, in posters, so in a lot of printed advertising material, it's also an architectural style. The idea behind Art Nouveau was to unite all of these different styles together with one sort of overall stylistic approach. So uniting all these very different fields, all these very different crafts. And so you see it in furniture, you see it in signs. And Art Nouveau is characterized by a lot of floral designs, leaves, plant motifs, a lot of curving lines. So you see here this sign is being suspended on a curving arch as opposed to like a straight post and lintel style arch. You can see a lot of curves here. Again, a lot of curving, almost vine-like decoration on the furniture. And very delicate metalwork, and of course, stained glass. Art Nouveau can be very difficult to distinguish from Art Deco if you don't know what to look for. We will talk a little bit about Art Deco when we talk about modernism, but Art Deco is about 30 years later, so that can help if you know the age of a piece or the age of a building. It can help you distinguish between Art Nouveau and Art Deco. And that is it for our Post-Impressionism. So I am going to log off and get this ready for you guys to view.